Today we're going to go over the answers to the study guide for chapter 16 through 19. So the study guide is about evolution. So we'll start with number 1. Number 1 should say that camouflage is an adaptation in which an organism blends into its environment. So camouflage is used by animals or other organisms to blend into their environment so they are less easily seen. Number 2 says mimicry is an adaptation in which an organism copies the appearance of another organism. So mimicry is where you'd have something, for example, like a caterpillar that has markings on one end that make it look like a snake, so it looks more threatening to potential predators so that they will avoid eating it. Number 3 says vestigial structures appear to have come from an ancestor but no longer have an important function. So like we see in the fossil record that there are some whales that still have hip bones even though they don't have hind legs. Humans have structures like the appendix, which is not functional, but it is attached to our large intestine, and it appears to have a vestigial function. Number 4 should say homologous structures show common ancestry, and that's because they are similar in structure but not necessarily function. So for example, you could look at birds. All birds have wings, but not all birds use their wings for flight. So the wings on a penguin are used for swimming, whereas the wings on a duck are generally used for flight. They're similar structure, but now they have evolved to have different functions. Number 5 says a bird wing and the human arm are considered homologous structures also. They're a forelimb, meaning they're an arm or something attached around some sort of shoulder girdle, but they have different functions. Number 6 says the human tailbone is considered a vestigial structure, right? Because our tailbone is no longer a tail, but we still have the series of bones in that region that could have been a tail in an ancestral species. Number 7 says natural selection is the process by which a population becomes better suited to its environment. And so that just means that as the environment may change, organisms are able to adapt through this process called natural selection so that they can become more capable of surviving in that environment. Number 8 says natural selection occurs when organisms with traits that make them more suited to their environment survive and reproduce more successfully than species less well suited to their environment. So natural selection also can give some species an advantage if they have adaptations that make survival in their environment a little bit easier. Number 9 says a duck's webbed feet is an example of an adaptation. Since ducks generally do a lot of swimming, having webs between their toes is useful because they are able to have more surface area push against the water when they're swimming, and so then they're able to move more efficiently. Number 10 says artificial selection occurs when a farmer breeds only his or her best livestock. So artificial selection occurs when people select the traits that they would like to see in animals or plants that they are breeding, and that way they get traits that they find desirable. So for example, when people breed plants like corn, they breed for, disease resistance so the plant does not get sick. They breed for more kernels of corn per ear so they have higher yield. So those are the sorts of things they would breed for. And in animals, for example, if you have milk cows, you want them to produce a lot of milk, so they'll breed the cows that are good milk producers. And then number 11 says fossils include shells, bones, traces of dead organisms, and insects trapped in tree sap, etc. So fossils are preserved specimens, and they can be preserved because they were mineralized in stone, or they could be trapped in tree sap or amber, but they're relics of life that existed a long time ago. Next, we'll go over some multiple choice, or some matching. So number 12 says convergent evolution. You should have found that convergent evolution is letter E, and that is that species becoming more similar over time because they live in similar environments. So an example would be like sharks, which are fish, and whales, which are mammals, both live in the water, so they've both adapted ways of moving through the water with fins, and they've both adapted ways of breathing, whether it's pulling oxygen from the water or pulling oxygen out of the air. Number 13 is divergent evolution. So that's letter A. This is when a species becomes more, or when two different species become more and more different from each other over time, even though they used to be similar. And so they diverge because they have been exposed to different environmental pressures. So an example would be like the finches that were on the Galapagos Islands that Darwin discovered. He found that these birds had diverged from a single species into several different species, and each of the species specialized in eating different types of food, so they had different shaped beaks. Number 14, gradualism, is letter D. And so that's a pattern in which species evolve at a slow, steady pace over time. Number 15, coevolution, is C. And that says that it's the back and forth evolution between two organisms that interact closely together. So for example, there's like flowers and their pollinators. So like in Minnesota, there's a flower that's red. It's called cardinal flower, and it has a long tube. And at the bottom of that tube is nectar, and hummingbirds are one of the only animals that are able to reach that nectar. So this plant and hummingbirds have developed a relationship where the plant has adapted a way to easily deliver food to the hummingbird, and the hummingbird in return pollinates the flower. And then number 16 is punctuated equilibrium. That's letter B. And that's a pattern in which species experience long, stable periods interrupted by periods of rapid evolution. So both gradualism and punctuated equilibrium are ways that evolution can progress, and it kind of depends on how rapidly the environment is changing. Number 17 is adaptive radiation. So you should have found that that's letter C. And this is when a species is introduced to a new environment, and then many different offshoots of that species develop. So adaptive radiation can be a part of the divergent evolution process. So it's when you start with one species and it has several different lineages that evolve into different species that fill different environmental niches. Number 18 is geographic isolation. That's letter E. And so this occurs when populations are separated by physical barriers, such as rivers, mountains, etc. So if there's a barrier that animals cannot cross, those two populations can no longer interbreed with each other. And so they will slowly develop characteristics that make them unable to breed with their ancestral population, so then they can become new species because they were geographically isolated. Number 19 is reproductive isolation. This is letter A. And this has to occur for a new species to form. If species can continually interbreed with each other, then they might be members of the same species. And so reproductive isolation is when you have two populations that are different enough from one another that they can no longer share DNA with each other, so they can't reproduce together. Number 20 is species. That's letter B. And this is an organism that can mate and have organisms that can mate and have fertile offspring with other members of the same species. And so like if you have a bunch of mallard ducks, for example, that's one species. They don't breed with other species of ducks. And then number 21 is mutation. That's letter D. And that is a change in the genetic material. So anytime a mutation occurs, it just means that the sequence of DNA has changed a little bit, and it can change by one letter, it can change by many letters, it can change because chromosomes have new genes that come from other chromosomes, but mutations are just changes in genetic material. And then number 22 is gene pool. So that's letter C. This is all of the genes carried in a population. So if you looked at humans, for example, the gene pool would be every different version of the genes that exist in humans. Number 23, evolution, is D. And this is what happens in a population when there's a change in the allelic frequency. So remember that alleles are the different versions of genes. If the frequency of those different traits changes, that means that evolution is occurring. Number 24 is genetic equilibrium, and that's letter A. This is when organisms or a population are in a situation in which the allelic frequency does not change. So it's stable. Equilibrium generally means stability. And so if you have an example for like mice, if most of the mice are brown and the environment has not changed very much, most of the mice will continue to be brown. If the environment were to change, like if, for example, there was a lava flow and now you have a whole bunch of rock that's black, the brown mice might stand out a little more than the variation that has black mice. And so some of those black mice might become more common because they can survive better on this new terrain that has begun to exist. Number 25 is genetic drift. This is letter B. And this occurs when allele frequencies change in small populations by chance. So it's random. It's not because of an environmental pressure. It's just that there happened to be like one breeding pair that was extremely prolific or something like that. And so you'll see this population change a little more significantly than you would expect because of a random change. Number 26 says, who is the father of evolutionary theory? You should remember that this is Charles Darwin. He was a British naturalist, and he's the one who first described evolution by natural selection. A lot of his ideas came from a trip he took around the world, and he sailed on a ship that was called the Beagle. And one of the places he visited that became kind of the basis of his theory, because they had so many different species and that had changed from the species that were on the mainland, was in the Galapagos Islands in Ecuador. So the Galapagos Islands are in the ocean. They're close enough to South America to sail there, but it's pretty isolated. There's a lot of geographic isolation. So when species move from the mainland to the Galapagos Islands, they don't generally move back to the mainland, so there's enough isolation that new species can form. On this page, we're going to talk about the shift in a population. And so we're going to talk about stabilizing selection, directional selection, and disruptive selection. So first, let's just talk about bell curves. So you can see here, this is a bell curve. You can see that it kind of looks like a bell. And what it does is show how many individuals in this example from a species have the different coat colors that are possible in mice. And you'll notice that the bell curve has this shape. That's called a normal distribution. The normal distribution means that most of the mice are this middle color, so this kind of brown color. And then we have several other colors that are less common towards the lighter side and then also towards the darker side. But the average color is this middle brown color. And so that means that that's the color that is most successful at surviving in the environment that it is currently living in. If the environment changes, or if the predators change, or if there's something that changes around these mice, then the coat color that is most successful, because it can be most easily hidden from predators, could change. So there's several different types of selection that are demonstrated by the bell curves at the bottom. So number 29 says, which letter shows stabilizing selection? Stabilizing selection means that the color that is most common becomes more common. And so if you look at this curve, you'll notice that this kind of medium brown mouse is the most common in the original population. And now it's becoming more common because this bell curve is getting steeper. And so that means there's more mice that are the brown color than there used to be. And so those mice become more common. It stabilizes the population and makes the most common color even more common. So that's letter C. Number 30 says, which letter shows directional selection? Directional selection means that this original population is either going to shift one way or the other. And so in our example, you can see in letter A that this has shifted in this direction. And so it's possible that there was like a volcanic eruption that made the ground where this mouse lives darker. And so that means that the mice that are darker colors, so this mouse and this mouse, are becoming more successful than the lighter colored mouse. So that's directional selection, because the population has shifted in one direction. And then number 31 says which letter shows disruptive selection. So disruptive selection means that the original color of the mice in this example become less successful, but the environment has changed in such a way that the mice that are at the tails of the bell curve, so the light colored mice and the dark colored mice, have both become more successful. And so that means that the original population color, which was the brown mice, has decreased. You can see that with that arrow here. And then the increase in population has occurred with these light colored mice and these dark colored mice. So that's disruptive selection, and that's letter B. And now we have a new type curve. When you have a curve that looks like this, where it's got two humps instead of one hump, that's called a bimodal curve. Next, we're going to talk about the evidence for evolution that occurs in kind of the biochemical structure of organisms. So first, let's talk about what this protein, cytochrome C, is. So cytochrome C is a protein, and it's a protein used in the electron transport chain of most organisms. So if you remember, the electron transport chain is part of your metabolic process, essentially. It's where electrons are moved through either the mitochondria, or in plants also there's this an electron transport chain in the photosynthetic cycle. So cytochrome C, very common protein in many organisms because we all have electron transport chains in our cells that contain mitochondria. So cytochrome C can be a little bit different in each species, and the number of differences in the amino acid sequence from cytochrome C can shed some light on how closely related organisms are to each other. So in this example, this chart tells us the number of differences in the cytochrome C protein between humans and these other organisms. And so number 32 says what organism is most closely related to humans. So when you look at this chart, you want to find the organism that has the fewest number of differences between humans and the cytochrome C amino acid sequence from a different species. And so you should notice that chimpanzees only have zero differences. So we have the same cytochrome C protein as chimpanzees. So they are the most closely related to humans because we have very, very similar, and in this case identical, DNA for this one protein. Number 33 says which organism is least closely related to humans. So something that's more distantly related would be something that has a large number of differences between their cytochrome C protein and ours. And so in this case, you'll notice that the yeast has very different cytochrome C protein. It has 42 amino acids that are different from our sequence. So we're not all that closely related to yeast. And then number 34 says, does this chart tell which organism is most closely related to a cow? And it does not, because you would have to look at the cow sequence and compare it to all these other organisms. This chart can only tell us how closely related things are to humans, because humans are the template sequence that we're using. If you wanted to compare how cows are related to these other organisms, you'd have to look at those sequences relative to the cow sequence. On the last page, we're going to go over these diagrams called cladograms. So a cladogram shows how things are related to each other in terms of characteristics that they might possess. So in this example, you can see like at the bottom of our clade here, we've got the vertebrate, and that means that something has a spinal cord. And you'll notice at the very bottom, everything that comes after that, sharks, fish, amphibians, etc., those are all organisms with spinal cords. So every single thing in this diagram has a spinal cord. But if you look at the next trait, bony skeleton, you'll notice that only ray-finned fish, amphibians, primates, rabbits, crocodiles, and birds have bony skeletons. And that's because sharks have a cartilaginous skeleton, and so they evolved before the bony skeleton became present in organisms. So anytime you have a trait, the things after that trait share that trait. So number 35 says, are primates more closely related to amphibians or crocodiles? So here we've got our primates, and if we trace this back, here's where they branch off. And they're going to be more closely related to crocodiles because they both share this trait of the amniotic egg. Amphibians do not have an amniotic egg, and so they evolved earlier than primates and crocodiles, which both have an amniotic egg. So they are more closely related to one another. Number 36 says, what type of animals have vertebrate, so they're of a spinal cord, bony skeleton, 4 limbs, but do not have an amniotic egg? And those organisms are, in fact, amphibians, right? Amphibians have all of those traits. They're vertebrates. They have a bony skeleton. They have 4 limbs, but they branch off here before the amniotic egg evolves.